أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. سل إماما عاش في العلم دهورا ودهور، يطلب العلم ببذل حتى ضمته البحور. سل إماما عاش في العلم دهورا ودهور، يطلب العلم ببذل حتى ضمته البحور. صابرا في العلم صبرا حتى سموه الصبور، يخرج العلم بفأل مثل ريحان الزهور. صابرا في العلم صبرا حتى سموه الصبور، يخرج العلم بفأل مثل ريحان الزهور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. كن إذا سموك اسما لتكن مثل الحضور، كن رفيقا كن عظيما كن كما تلك الصقور. كن إذا سموك اسما لتكن مثل الحضور، كن رفيقا كن عظيما كن كما تلك الصقور. راقيا بالعلم نحو النجم مزدان شكور، رافضا كل التدني رافضا نفس الغرور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. ابن مسعود فقيه علم أحيا القفور، فإذا أعطاك رأيا كان سهما في النحور. ابن مسعود فقيه علم أحيا القفور، فإذا أعطاك رأيا كان سهما في النحور. وعلي ثم بالدين معاذ ليبور، اقرأوا التاريخ تروي عنه أفواه سطور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. إن سألت عن إمام أو فقيه في الأمور، ابن عباس ترنم وسيبقى في الصدور. إن سألت عن إمام أو فقيه في الأمور، ابن عباس ترنم وسيبقى في الصدور. فهو كالشمعة تذهب حتى تأتينا بنور، ساهرا بالليل علم وبأوقات سحور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. إذ بكى النبي يوما سمعا صوتا جهور، يا أبي كم روت عنك الليالي والعصور. إذ بكى النبي يوما سمعا صوتا جهور، يا أبي كم روت عنك الليالي.
الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome to Islamic Oasis Live once again this Friday evening, and as always we are trying our best to bring the best of the Summah, the activists, the scholars, the teachers, those involved in the da'wah work, the da'wah carriers, and brothers and sisters who care for the Summah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, brothers and sisters, it's amazing how much support that we are getting from you, because it seems that the discussions that we are having on this on this panel or in this this type of media, it's really having effects, and we can see that from your responses, from the calls that we receive, from the emails that we are receiving. So please continue to bring that on. So today, as we know, we have a very special guest and a very special topic, and that topic is a topic of the fall of the dollar. And to discuss this very important discussion on the currency, especially what is known as the dollar. We have Brother Jamal Harwood. Many of you are very well known. He's an amazing speaker. He speaks on economy almost all the time. He has his own channel. He speaks on many dawah events regarding regarding economies, regarding growth, development, the Muslim world, the future of the Muslim world, what the Muslim world is going through today. He himself is a chartered accountant. He became a Muslim, subhanallah, 35 years ago. Hafidhullah. He's from London, UK. Active dawah career in the last 30 years with organization Hizb al-Tahrir. So here we have Brother Jamal Harwood. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykhi. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuhu. Very good, thanks, alhamdulillah. Nice to be here.
Barakallah feek. Sheikh, let's get with this conversation. First of all, if you can, why is this topic important? The fall of the dollar. What should be the concern? What is it that constantly, this is a worry of almost every capital in the world, that what could happen to the dollar? And why is it so important? If you can kind of give us a background on this so that we can then, kind of break the whole discussion.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is important because we're talking about money. So the dollar is what we would refer to as the global reserve currency. It's the most dominant currency in the world, meaning that over 65% of reserves which countries are keeping is generally held in the dollar. Not only that, in terms of international transactions, buying and selling between countries, again, the biggest majority is in the dollar. So it's very well, respected, and it's used. And in many countries which have weak currencies, again, they will use the dollar. And the other point I will mention is that politically, the Americans have quite cleverly kind of enforced the dollar by having it as, what they call the petrodollar. So again, most transactions in oil and gas in the international markets are settled in the dollar, and that provides a demand for the dollar which it wouldn't normally have. And the other key thing was, post-World War II, the Americans gave very large loans across Europe, which of course was devastated by that war, in dollars. So that became known, they called it like the euro dollar. So this is meaning that it became de facto the main currency that people used. So, money is an important subject. It's important because it gives people sort of purchasing power. You're paid your wages, you trade your goods for money. So money, for millennia is of great importance to people. So this is why this is a key subject.
Sheikh, a question with that. So when we talk about, to say or to have a subject, fall of the dollar, is this relevant? Or is it that, okay, well, we're talking about 60% of the world currency today is in dollar. Countries, weak or strong, many of them are backed by the dollar. You have, trade is dollar. You talked about the petrodollar. How viable is this discussion? Meaning, I'm putting it out there in a sense that, are we building castles in the air, or is this real?
Well, it's a good point, and I wouldn't be so bold as to say that the dollar's about to drop. In fact, if we look over the last 10 days, with this issue between Russia and Ukraine and the invasion and what have you, there's a dollar index, okay, which is the most, comparing the dollar to the other major currencies like the British pound, the euro, the Japanese yen, and so on. And the dollar index has shot up. It's gone from 96 up to 98.5, and that's quite a big move up. So the dollar is actually strengthening, and this is what's known as sort of like a safe haven move, meaning that people are seeing it as a safe haven. And of course, the Russian ruble has dropped by more than 30%, and there's a lot of instability in the world. But obviously, it's affecting gold, silver, and other things. But anyway, the point I would say is this: is that if we look back in history, there's always a dominant currency. There's always it's a dollar, or it was the British pound before that, or it was the Portuguese or Spanish, or there's periods of time in which a currency has its part to play. And of course, it is related to the geopolitical situation in terms of who is the dominant nation. What is the leading nation of the world? So the leading superpower is the United States. We like it, we don't like it, whatever, that's the reality. Now, of course, these things don't last forever. And the question many people are saying is that, with the US with $30 trillion of debt, with the Federal Reserve, the so-called central bank of the US sitting on $9 trillion on its balance sheet of money that it's basically printed, a lot of quantitative easing, people say that, the balance of payments in the US is out of control. These are signs which worry the economists, which is worrying those which look carefully at the status of the dollar. And this is why many people are saying, well, how long can this continue? And even over this conflict with Ukraine, it's putting pressure, of course, on Russia, but Russia can also take certain measures. They've been building up their gold reserves, as an example. They've been threatened with removal from SWIFT. SWIFT is a global messaging system which enables commerce and trade to function well. So, this is threatening Russia by many of its banks being suspended from using SWIFT, which no doubt will cause headaches. But the Russians, the Chinese, they have alternative messaging systems. This is a challenge to the hegemony of the US dollar. So, it's not just one-way traffic in terms of saying that, the dollar is king and is always going to be king. What ebbs and flows in terms of the global geopolitical position is also going to ebb and flow in terms of the dollar.
Sheikh, so when we're talking about fall of the dollar here, I understand. This is you've mentioned a lot of points here that need to be looked at. Is usually when people talk about fall of the dollar, we're talking about, is that because the fall of the value of the dollar, meaning due to inflation? So, but you're saying that, look, you're talking about $30 trillion of debt, and then using tools as quantitative easing in order to somehow, balance that. But so is what's happening in Russia? Is this another way of quantitative easing? If you understand what I'm saying.
No, but yeah, let me explain a bit further, because you raise a good point, which is
I just want to say that, is this a political move?
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I started looking at the big picture, in terms of what is the dollar as the global currency. And I've raised the question, how long is that going to continue? Can that continue? We will have this conversation in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, if we're still around ourselves. But the point is that the dollar will not maintain this leadership position forever. So we need to keep an eye on that. But the other factor about the decline or the fall of the dollar, of course, is the purchasing power of the dollar, which relates to the thorny issue of inflation. And this does have an impact in terms of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia at the moment, because there's a relationship between the amount of money in circulation and what we call like the purchasing power of that money. So if there is constantly increasing amounts of money in circulation, so there's more money chasing after the same amount of goods and services, that causes inflation, meaning that your purchasing power is reduced from the same amount of dollars. I mean, you'll see that in your wage check, meaning can you buy the same amount of food? Can you pay your rent? Can you pay, your fuel bill, to heat your home, to put petrol, to put gas in your car? All of this becomes a challenge when there's inflation, because you're still getting the same amount of dollars, but they're buying less. And actually in the US at the moment, the inflation rate is 7.5%. In fact, some economists say it's actually much higher than that, because one of the things they do is they very helpfully, they change the way they calculate inflation. So it's supposed to be a consistent basket of goods, and if you make that consistent over many years, you can see what the price of those goods are relative to the dollar, and that will give you an idea of this inflation. So inflation is eating away at your wealth. It's eating away at this purchasing power of the money, and it's a very serious problem. And in fact, governments use inflation because it's also eating away at the value of the debt. So one way to pay back debt, and I suspect that the $30 trillion will never be paid back, is to basically inflate it away. So if you actually have a decline in the value of the dollar, what you're paying back is actually much less. Let me give you a very simple example. I mean, if somebody had a loan, if you owed $1,000, and a year later that dollar is worth, it's lost in value by 10%, it means that your repayment of $1,000 is actually easier, because the $1,000 is not worth $1,000. It's actually worth that less than 10% less than that. It's like $900. So this inflation is something which governments can use to devalue the level of their loans. So, and in fact, if inflation goes very high, it's actually quite a neat trick, in terms of doing this. But of course, the people are those which suffer, because your wages, although they're probably going up, usually do not go up by the same rate of inflation. So your cost of living becomes more expensive, and you don't have sufficient, to make do. And this is really oppressive. This is great oppression and dhulm, and alhamdulillah, in Islam we have a way to deal with this by having a proper monetary standard.
Sheikh, as far as inflation is concerned, are we going towards another are we going towards a third wave of crisis? We saw what happened, for instance, Orange Revolution, this and that in Central Asia. Then we went through so-called Arab revolts, the Arab Spring, and this, and then now with Ukraine situation and the Russian situation and this whole gas situation and inflation at the levels that it is today, are we looking at a crisis in food, where average people will not be able to get food to their families. I mean, is this something real? Meaning, you look at, for instance, I was looking at the Egyptian situation. Egypt subsidizes even bread to its people. Yani if inflation goes that high where people can't get bread because of this conflict, are we looking at a coming crisis, and hence more inflation and and never-ending crisis? I mean, where are we going? I mean, what's the deal?
Yeah, I mean, the point is that this conflict with Russia and Ukraine is really significant in terms of various commodities. The oil and gas is critical for Europe. Russia provides more than 35% of the gas to Europe, and for the Germans it's even higher. So they are really in a bind. They're in a not that much, but it's certainly a really significant amount, and it's not an amount that they can really easily replace in the short term. Now, this is not such an issue for the United States because they have a lot of gas themselves. They have a lot of gas and oil in the US. The point is that this will be very inflationary. I mean, here in the UK, United Kingdom, the price of gas is going up by 40% next month. And then people are saying it's going to go up another 30% in October. So that's really significant amounts of increase, and that's even before this war gets going. Now, you mentioned Egypt. Egypt is of great concern, and of course many other places in the Muslim world, because they are very dependent on wheat imports. You mentioned bread and bread subsidy. So Russia and Ukraine are major providers of wheat to Egypt and to many other countries. And so, for example, Ukraine has completely stopped any production of wheat, at the moment with this conflict. So this is going to also create a supply squeeze for Egypt and others. Now, will that be destabilizing? Will that lead to rioting in the streets? There will be all sorts of potential impacts of this. You rightly say that the government there is subsidizing wheat, but when there's a lack of wheat available, that's a serious problem. And I do believe that the United States and other actors on the world stage are quite happy to see this type of conflict. They're happy to see this type of conflict in Europe. They're happy to see it elsewhere in the Middle East and so on. This is what they thrive on. They thrive on chaos. They thrive on situations which they can take advantage of. This is one reason why the dollar is still hegemonic, is still the king in terms of world usage, because there's no real alternative being applied. And this is the challenge that we as Muslims have in terms of bringing back Islam and bringing back proper monetary matters. Now, the last point I'll mention is that for Egypt, again, it's criminal that the regime in Egypt has happily gone along with policies whereby they're now dependent on importing wheat and other key commodities. Egypt is an incredibly vast and prosperous land with the Nile and great water resources, and should be able to produce its own wheat. But what happens is they've been trapped by IMF loans and the need to repay loans and interest on loans and interest and more debt. And their instructions are they want cash crops, like cotton, for example, which is very debilitating for the soil, and takes away from the ability to feed the people in Egypt, because they're diverting their agricultural resources into other things. So this is criminal, meaning now we're dependent in Egypt upon wheat imports. So we're now at the beck and call of this crisis in Ukraine and Russia, and the next crisis that comes along. So we need to have a greater view towards self-sufficiency in our countries. Otherwise, we're going to be burnt time and time again.
Sheikh, the issue of now, for instance, with UK and Ukraine situation, the way it is, Russia and Ukraine situation, are we going to see? Maybe we are already seeing it, a multipolar world, where it's no longer just singular, American hegemony that's there, but let's say there is Central Asia by itself with the countries in that region, and then you have US and whatever in the Middle East. I mean, what? Because you're talking about Egypt, and you're saying that look, these countries, they need to, especially the Muslim countries, they need to be self-sufficient. Is it more possible now than it was before because there are conflicts amongst powers to make the world self-sufficient, or is it that you will have, because now you have two world powers and countries will have to take sides in order to survive?
Well, I mean, there are several sides and several players on the main stage. Obviously, the key issue for the US at the moment is China. China is seen as the biggest challenge to its leadership position. And in particular, they talk about the Asia pivot and the need to contain China, because China has become a major economic power and has influence and ambitions, for example, in Africa and elsewhere. So the Americans obviously want to contain China, so that's part of its policy. So it's not, it's part of the strategy of the Americans to have these conflicts. So for example, the advantage that they can see between the Russian and Ukrainian conflict is that maybe they will be bogging down, Russia will get bogged down in this conflict in the same way that they were bogged down in Afghanistan, for 20 years. So, and it creates instability in Europe, which they can take advantage of in the sense that they can be seen as strengthening their leadership, as their leadership of NATO, and they paint, Russia as the villain, and come in and even help possibly with some of the gas supplies, which countries like Germany are going to find as a crisis point. So this is part of the American strategy. And it's also creating a warning signal to the Chinese, and the Chinese are well aware of what's going on and acting accordingly in terms of, their focus within their own backyard in Asia and in Taiwan and other situations like that. So you need to look at the actions of these countries and not just what they say. And the actions we can see the Americans are doing is that actually, if anything, it's almost inflaming this conflict, because they haven't really done anything that serious in terms of the sanctions against Russia. So it's actually almost been like an encouragement for them to enter into Ukraine. And I can see certain advantages for the Americans.
What are the advantages? I mean, this is very interesting because, so you're saying, this is interesting. I didn't look at it that way. So you're saying that Americans could, this is a situation where Americans could get the Russians involved in a American-Afghan type situation and continue supporting one side in order to create a conflict. Does that, then what happens? I mean, you have, so Europe, Americans, you won't, Americans don't have much concern about what really happens in Europe. I mean, or is that keeping Europe behind, the unity of, destroying the unity of Europe, or keeping Europe behind keeps America unchallenged, or is it destroys the markets for China so that China is also dependent on the Americans? Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, 20 years ago, the Europeans launched the euro.
Right.
And the euro, which is an important currency, and many actually saw that as being a challenge to the dollar, because you're talking about a similar population, in fact, a larger population than the United States in Europe using the euro. But since that time, Europe has been weakened. They've been weakened with the departure of Britain from the European Union. We've seen problems in the north versus the south of Europe, and we've got now a very serious refugee crisis involving not only Ukraine but also Muslims coming from Syria, Libya, and elsewhere, where other conflicts have been waged, at the behest of the Americans. So the Americans are keeping Europe, kind of under containment, and so much so that the European project, has got question marks over it. Some people are questioning as to how long this European Union can last in its current format, because, it's not actually meeting the objectives which it had. Nevertheless, America sees NATO as a very important part of its strategy, and it has strong leadership over NATO, and it wants to maintain that. And this action against Ukraine is actually, if anything, strengthening the American position as the leader of NATO. So that's a couple of important points I've mentioned in terms of how they can benefit. The other thing, of course, is that where other nations are in conflict, that provides an opportunity for its defense industry, its provision of weaponry and so on and so forth. And of course, it's commodities and oil, gas, wheat, all of these other things. It actually provides opportunities for it as well, or to direct it towards friends which it wants to. So the Americans do not lose out when other parts of the world become destabilized and even go to fight against each other. Obviously, there's some higher risks if it became a nuclear conflict, and that's a whole new ball game, as they say. But I don't think it's likely to go like that. But definitely the Russians could get bogged down in Ukraine in coming months and years. And that neutralizes Russia and creates a problem on Europe's doorstep. And that, in a way, doesn't give Russia to be a potential strong ally with China, which was one potential problem as well for the Americans. And the Americans can focus more of its attentions on China without being so concerned about Russia. Although the opposite argument would say that, for example, threatening to take them out of the SWIFT system pushes them towards their own payment systems. And the Russians and Chinese do have one, the CIFS system, which helps for settlement of money. And, so the more people are using alternatives, is also acts as a challenge to the dollar. So, the Russians knew that actions in Ukraine would likely cause problems, for example, with nations restricting their reserves, if they were holding reserves offshore. So the Russians were putting a lot of their reserves into gold. They moved a lot of their reserves into the renminbi, the Chinese yuan. They, as I say, they bought a lot of gold. They sold a lot of U.S. treasuries because they knew that they would have a great risk of these. And again, that's been borne out with these sanctions which come along. And I would say this is a great lesson for the Muslim Ummah, because obviously we have ambitions for the reestablishment of the Khilafah. the Khilafah Rashida in our lands, and we will expect the exact same things. You know, potential war, certainly boycotts, certainly freezing us out in terms of international financial institutions and systems. So we've got to be prepared, and we have to understand what the playbook is that the Americans are using, because we're going to face the same problem.
Sheikh, so you there's a lot of things that you've said there. The number one issue, when it comes to, so America has basically divided the Chinese and the Russians in this conflict. Is this one thing that this is one thing that we learned, that okay, well, they've been able to create a situation, or at least create a wedge where Russia is completely bogged down into this situation with Ukraine, and even having China as a supportive, having as an ally doesn't really do much, meaning to strengthen that relationship in that region versus the United States.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, what I meant is that there's elements of this in the sense that the relationship between China and Russia could strengthen from this, in the sense that they both know the dangers of the U.S. hegemony on the world stage. So in that sense, that they have potential, although they're not natural allies, and obviously they do have a history of some conflicts previously. But the point is that they both understand that the dollar can be used as a weapon, and the dollar can be used as a weapon, for example, in the SWIFT payment system. If you can't use the de facto world payment system, which the Americans dominate, then you're going to have serious problems. If your reserves are going to be frozen globally, that's going to create problems. If they're going to create problems in terms of boycotting your trade, then that's going to cause issues. Now, opportunities for the Russians is that, okay, if Europe is forced not to take Russian oil and gas, for example, particularly gas, then the Russians need to find alternative markets to that. So, for example, China and others. So that will then put pressure on China in the same way that the Americans have been putting pressure on any country which breaks sanctions against Iran. So we've seen this game in the last 10 years, is that it puts a lot of pressure on Iran by the sanctions which they impose. But not only that, it's threatening sanctions for the nations which would dare to trade with Iran. So this is all the tentacles which the Americans are trying and enforce. Now, will they be successful in putting such pressure on China? We'll have to wait and see.
Sheikh, you mentioned something else also, that the Muslims have to learn a lesson from this, especially those who are actually working to reestablish Islam in a form of a state again. There is so much. When you look at the pressure that's there on even countries like Russia, which is not it's not just any state. It has been a world power still, at least maybe at some level it is a power. It's being pressured into a corner while being active as an active player on the world stage. Having the experience that it has, having the resources that it has, with all of this is being put in such a corner. I need two answers. In whatever format. One, what is it about Americans, as far as their strategic maneuvering, the viewpoint, or the way they're able to play the game that they play? What is it in them that they could do this? And number two, if a state comes along, a Muslim state, Islamic state comes along, can it handle the pressure that a country like Russia is being put on today? But first, give me the first answer. I would really like to know, where does is it just the ideological view? I mean, the Russians are capitalist, and so are the Chinese. The Americans are able to maneuver in such an amazing way. What makes that happen, Sheikh?
Yeah, I mean, there are some differences in terms of capitalism, between Russians, Chinese, and certainly Americans. I mean, we have the concept of like state capitalism, which is a little bit more centralized control, of which maybe the West is becoming more aligned with that. Anyway, we've seen, incredible rolling back of the rights and liberties of the public in the last 2 years, for example, over this virus. But still, yes, the key driver, of course, is ideological. The secular, liberal, capitalist order is the main factor. And this, of course, is a basis upon which the nations will seek to protect their interests. So, for example, the main interest of the Russians is that they cannot allow NATO to encroach onto their front doorstep, so to speak. The Russians have experienced in the last 100 years Hitler invading them from Europe, and if we go back a couple of 100 years before that, we can see the Napoleon invading Russia as well. So there is no way, and again, Putin explained this well. He said there's no way that they can accept to have a country like Ukraine become now part of NATO. So this is obviously the prime motivation that they have. This is their interest, to ensure that their defense and security is sound. So the American interest, of course, is to maintain its leadership, to maintain its position with the dollar, and obviously to exploit the resources of the world almost as its own. That involves them maintaining their leadership over other nations, including, the leadership of Europe and NATO, and also being able to control key resources like we see in the Middle East in terms of the control of the oil resources of the Middle East, for example. This is why we've seen action in Iraq and action elsewhere in the Middle East, and will continue to do so, sadly. But it's in defense of American interests, which is what's happening.
Sheikh, when it comes to this area, again, just going back to one more issue before I go on, I want to take some questions, but I wanted to ask, so it's the ideological understanding, but the question was, Russians are also capitalists, are they not?
Yeah, well, since Perestroika, which was 30 years ago,
okay,
when effectively, they abandoned communism. But as I say, it's not, it's a form of capitalism because it's a centralized, you still have the centralized system. Government. Nominally, they have elections and what have you, but it is fully centralized. In the same way, in China, you've got the Communist Party, of China, which is there and does not have a challenger. But again, what you might call state socialism or state capitalism, in the sense that it's a centralized system on the top of a more open business corporate allowance, meaning that you can have a lot of companies. And again, in the Russian model, again, we've got a lot of oligarchs which have formed large companies and basically exploited the resources. So these are all variations. I mean, there's no pure form of capitalism.
Are we moving towards a more, one-party system in the world? Is that, or that's not efficient? Because the way I was thinking, it seems that, in one way, the Russians are, this conversation kind of makes me feel that the Russians kind of fell into a trap, but they were forced into a trap. They had no choice. This was an existentialist, situation. They just could not have NATO there, so they were put into a trap. They're forced into taking action there. On the other hand, you have China, which is growing, but it is a form of capitalism, but it is more of a one-party system, and it's very efficient at what it's doing. So, is the world moving towards this type of supposed sufficiency, or is it you're going to see more of American capitalism in the world?
It's an interesting question. I mean, you've got the sort of the World Economic Forum types, the Klaus Schwabs and all of this type of stuff, advocating a more centralized form of government. So there are advocates for that, but I don't really think that you're going to break down this, the question of, for example, the Democrats and the Republicans and the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and all of these other ways which are seen in this secular, liberal, democratic Western world. Although the reality is that many of those politicians, you don't really see significant differences between them in terms of their policy. They're still emboldened and supported by the large corporate entities. So you have, corporatocracies, rather than autocracies. Although, you can see some major factors, the industrial military complex, as Dwight Eisenhower, former president, warned about. You've got the large pharmaceutical conglomerates, which again, we've seen it play in the last couple of years. You've got some of these others, which are, the oil, companies and sort of their reach and their control and influence. So this is kind of a model that we're seeing now, which is a bit less distinguished from, the so-called, pure democratic process, which is supposed to be looking after the affairs of the people. It's kind of more like looking after the affairs of the large corporate interests. And again, when you break that down, it's actually not so many people owning those large corporations. In fact, a lot of them, funnel through, 2 or 3 major corporations, the major investment conduits, like BlackRock, Vanguard. And then if you go in behind those, there's major so-called foundations which basically run them. So, yes, we are losing the notion of this sort of democratic, secular, liberal order into a more autocratic, controlled society, without a doubt. But how that's going to progress, how much pushback we get from the public, these are interesting times, really.
I have one more question. Well, they're asking me to ask questions from the public, but I do have one more before we go to the public here. Sheikh, this area that Ukraine is in, or this whole area of Russia and Pakistan and Afghanistan, this it's an area that has 4 nuclear weapons, 4 nuclear powers. You have the largest GDP in the world. You have the largest population, a young population. You have, with all of this, how, what are we looking at as far as if there is a continuous conflict in this area, or you need conflict in this area just because of the powers at B? I mean, is this a necessary conflict type of thing where you need to have? I mean, it's a very sensitive area of the world, with so many powers trying to compete.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we can see Islamic revival. You mentioned Pakistan. If we go to the Fergana Valley, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, these are incredibly important regions of the world, not only in terms of the numbers of people that are living there, but also the resources, the minerals, oil, gas, and many other reserves which are largely untapped. And also great agricultural resources, if you look at Pakistan as an example. So these are great opportunities for the Muslim Ummah in terms of its revival and focus for re-establishment of the next Khilafah Rashida. Now, Allah knows whether it would come in this region or whether it's going to come in the Middle East or Turkey or where have you, but definitely it's an important region. But also, it's also a dangerous region because we have the Russians, we have the Chinese, we have India, and they're all very antagonistic towards Islam. So it's not an easy neighborhood to be living in, but still, it's a great challenge for the Ummah, and we do see big steps forward in terms of an intellectual revival amongst the people and people calling for Khilafah, the return of the Islamic State.
All right, let's take the questions here. First question from someone named, well, what happened there? Okay, somebody from okay, you don't have, oh, there was a question and then, okay. All right, so do you have it, or I'll go on with what I have to ask? Okay, so Sheikh, I mean, they're trying to fix something on the question side, but so now we are in March, and subhanallah, this has been, this is the month where we, 1924, the Khilafah falls, and here we are again. We are in a situation where most of the discussion is happening, with these events constantly taking place. Sheikh, how as Muslims, how do we create our own narrative? What do we need to do to create this narrative that, look, the whole world is, everyone is moving their interests the way they want, except the Muslims. If we look at this conflict itself that is taking place, obviously everybody will be talking about this conflict. Again, either this conflict can just take us on and then move on to any direction that they want to, or we ourselves realize that we need a direction. What do we need to do? I know you mentioned the Khilafah state, but what is it? How is it possible in this, because this is the question that we always asked. I mean, or this is what happens. I mean, since this whole thing started with Ukraine, a lot of people are talking about malhama, and people are talking about, where instead of looking at this thing from a realistic perspective, people are looking at this from the perspective of, the Dajjal is coming and so and so. How do we make the Muslims realize and see the issues the way they are, the realities of the issues, whether with what's happening, and how, if we don't build something for ourselves, that we are ordered to, by the way, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where are we going to end up? Because, if you have two powers now, let's say there is a China and there's an America, there is a Russia. I mean, the way it's going, we were being slapped around by one, which was US. Now we'll be slapped around by three.
Yeah, but we've been slapped around for quite a while, and I think today was the
Nigerian turn.
March.
No, and never mind. I just wanted to mention the Nigerian, the Putin situation. He told them if even we see one of your soldiers in Ukraine, we'll make sure we total the whole country, starting from Lagos.
Yeah, I was just about to say that we're here. We are 4th of March, and it was 98 years ago, according to the Western calendar, that the caliphate was disbanded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, working in conspiracy with the British and others. And since that time, we have seen disaster upon disaster as the Muslim Ummah was divided into small pieces. So these issues of occupation, whether that's Palestine or Kashmir or the Ujirs in East Turkestan, or there's and also the conflicts that we're seeing in Syria, Iraq, the Yemen, Libya, all of these realities are a painful reminder to us day by day of the weakness that we would be if we continue in this disunified approach, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتَّصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and hold firm all of you to the rope of Allah and be not just disunified. So the rope of Allah is the Quran, so we need to actually adhere to Islam and actually implement Islam. This is the reality. And of course, unify our lands, and then we've got incredible resources, massive manpower, and ability to defend ourselves and implement Islam and indeed carry it to mankind. So that's our key priority. But we started this conversation talking about the dollar, and now we've moved on to some of the geostrategic matters in relation to Russia, Ukraine. But if I just go back to the dollar for one moment, the Islamic system is gold and silver as money. So we call it a bimetallic standard. So that is the obligation in the Muslim world, is to have gold and silver as money. So alhamdulillah, when we had that system, and again the world has operated under this in the Muslim world and elsewhere for hundreds and hundreds of years, and millennia in fact. And in those periods of time they had low inflation, low levels of deflation, and they had great stability and great prosperity in terms of trade because people knew what they were dealing with. So this is just one example that we can get across to the Muslims of the strength of the Islamic system. And the Muslims are waking up to exactly what these regimes are about, which we had so-called independence, that there's no independence, that these regimes in our lands are basically under the thumb and control of the Western powers. That they have their political qibla is towards Washington and Downing Street and Paris and elsewhere. So that is very much exposed, and we have to continue this revival, which will lead to a change of regime, a change of system in our lands, and that's the key priority that we're facing now.
Sheikh, this is very interesting. When we talk about gold and silver, one of the things I was, I guess this is my analysis, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. The issue of, for instance, where Russia is stuck on this issue, because the infrastructure is the same as far as a currency that is based on printing without being backed by gold. They have the same issues of inflation and all of these other things, and hence dependent on same capitalist maneuvering as the rest. But bringing in the Islamic system, the gold and silver, if we were ever in a situation that Russia is in, we would not be stuck in the situation that Russia is, because our currency is not dependent on anything that they have manufactured. Am I right in this, saying that would that just being
that's right. I mean, there's the Russians have diversified away from US dollar holdings because they knew that they would have this problem. But they haven't done it fully. They haven't put everything into gold. And they still have euros, which they're holding. They still have some dollars they're holding, some pounds, British pounds, and of course some Chinese yuan. And that is money of other states. And which means that the valuation and ultimate control of those currencies is with other states. But that's not the case with gold and silver. The gold and silver stands on its own. It's nobody's liability. It's basically something of value, which is in great demand and can always be readily traded and readily provided. So the Russians would have been happier if they had no dollar reserves and everything in gold, but they haven't managed to do that. And of course, when the Khilafah Rashida state is returned, it will have its own money, will be based on gold and silver. So we cannot, we're not going to see a 30%, drop in the value of the ruble, which would happen in terms of gold, because gold, for example, in times of stress goes up in value compared to fiat money, with paper money. So it's actually the ultimate safe haven. I said that the dollar had been going up in the last week. The thing that was really going up is gold and silver at the point in time, because they are the ultimate safe haven.
Sheikh, so how does growth take place? Because a lot of times Muslims, they have these questions, or even general masses, that, well, we have a limited amount of gold, a limited amount of silver, then how are we going to grow the economy? What just because of the limitation factor, what is the answer to that? And how does the economic system based on is it even a limitation? If you can.
No, it's not a limit. It's not a limit, because the amount of gold which is mined every year is about 1.5%, 1.5 to 2% a year. So there is a steady increasing supply there, which is perfectly adequate. And also in the Muslim world, we have some of the really key gold reserves and resources. And in fact, we have the largest gold mine in the world in Papua. So this is not an issue. But as people that study things like Bitcoin will tell you, it's not so much the question of how much you have, it's what is the unit which you're doing. So again, if you have, for example, a gold dinar, which is just a few grams of gold, its actual relative value in terms of its purchasing ability is very strong. So, but the fact is when you use gold and silver, they're also divisible. So you could have a 100th of a dinar, for example, or you can have 1/10 of a dinar. You don't just have to deal in dinars. You see what I'm saying? So if you have X number of tons of gold, as long as it's in a format that the public can use it and can use for trade and to facilitate trade, then that's what you want. Meaning that you don't want restrictions on trade, and that would be thereby a shortage. But it just means that the units that you're using would have greater value. And as long as you have it divisible, which of course gold and silver is very divisible into very tiny units, then you can use it.
So wouldn't that afford or affect trade, in the sense that when you have gold and silver, and then if other countries don't want to trade in gold and silver, either they won't do any trade with you, or how? Because you want to be a state where everyone is coming to do trade with you. So we are basically forcing the world to go to gold and silver, number one, I guess. And number two, but why would the world want to do that, in a sense that they might lose their gold currency to you?
Well, first of all, I don't think that they will all go to gold themselves. In fact, they would have to be dragged kicking and screaming to go back to a gold standard, because these governments, they love the paper money system because, they're not accountable. They can overspend as they like. Yeah, they print more paper, quantitative easing, they print more paper money. So They've been doing that for years and years, whereas gold keeps you honest because you can't print gold. You've only got X amount of gold. But what happens is, you're quite right, there will be some trade issues and there could be some trade barriers. But let's assume that we're selling oil, and there's many countries out there that really need oil, like Japan. You know, they're really heavily dependent on oil. China, for that matter, as well. So they're very dependent on oil. So we can sell them oil. Now, what do we get paid for? Well, we can ask for gold, and if necessary, they go into the gold market and buy it and then settle it to us. Now, let's say we're buying technology from Japan, because Japan is an advanced country and has a lot of technology. So if we're buying from Japan and they want us to settle in Japanese yen, that's no problem. We can take gold, sell the gold in the international market for Japanese yen, and use that yen to buy technology. So at the end of the day, it's just another currency. It's just another thing of money. You know, if we're buying an airplane and we have to pay for it in dollars, we can buy dollars on the open market, on the international markets, and settle that with gold. And this is what other countries can do. Other countries can use their currencies to buy gold and then ship gold to us for the oil that we sell, as an example. Yeah. So that doesn't mean that they're now in the gold standard. It just means that they have to do another transaction of providing gold if we want to be settled in gold. Or similarly for us, if they want to be settled in Japanese yen or US dollars, we do another transaction of selling gold for dollars or for yen, and then we use that to buy their goods.
This is very interesting. We actually have to have a conversation just on the trade one day, because this actually had many questions in my mind. Do we have any questions? Okay, go ahead. Let's go to the question. Someone named Ahmed. Ahmed says, how can Muslims build their financial infrastructure to be ready when the Khilafah is established? That's a very good question. Actually, I am very interested in hearing that answer.
Well, sadly, a lot of the financial infrastructure has got to be sort of driven by the state. It's kind of top down. And if there's not a good financial infrastructure at the moment, this will cause problems. But we do have banks in the Muslim world. Now, obviously, these banks are doing a lot of haram stuff, but there is infrastructure there in the banking system. And there's also various other markets, fairly advanced markets. So, for example, there's stock markets. Now, again, we don't accept a stock market because we believe that the contract of a company, you know, the PLC, private limited companies, the joint stock companies, is forbidden in Islam. So on this basis, we will have to have different company structures. But again, you've got a lot of infrastructure there in terms of some of these markets. We've got very developed communications markets and telecommunications and internet and so on. So we do actually have a reasonable amount of infrastructure, but we're going to have to establish more. And that's going to come when the Khilafah Rashida state is re-established, because we'll have a leadership which is highly motivated to implement, you know, a proper functioning, you know, establish a Bayt al-Mal, which is the state treasury, and use its resources in terms of collection of tax and zakat and distribution and so on and so forth, and establishing a lot of the industrial infrastructure. I would think that we need more industrial infrastructure than necessary financial infrastructure, but obviously we do need the institutions of state, including the Bayt al-Mal, the state treasury.
So would you I mean, are you saying that at least before the formation, and wherever the state comes, it comes, but should we help at least before the Khilafah comes to help support rebuild the infrastructure? I mean, at least the industrial infrastructure of the Muslim countries. Would you say that was something that the Muslims should do?
I would say it's very good for yourself and your listeners, to become expert in areas which will be of use to the Khilafah state. So if you're an engineer, then it's important for you to be available for the Khilafah state to work as an engineer. If you're a financial expert or an accountant or one of these functions, again, you will be of great use to the Khilafah state when it is established. So this is where you need to develop your expertise and so on and so forth. If you're a doctor, a medical doctor, again, you want to be as well ahead in terms of the current, advancement in terms of medicine and all of these sorts of things, in terms of helping the Muslims when the Khilafah state is established. And again, obviously things like hospital management and management of schools and management of industrial projects and all of these types of things will require expertise. So this is an area where we need to focus. But we can't say, well, we need to establish a new form of internet or something like this. This may be something which would be done, but it's not something that can be done necessarily now. But the preparation for that can be done in terms of the PhD studies which you could participate in the research which you can do, in terms of knowledge of the various markets, how the gold market operates, for example. These are sorts of things which your listeners, can help the next Khilafah state function on by doing that. So these are the areas which I would encourage the youth to study when they're considering, their university degrees and research projects and all that sort of thing.
Next question from Brother Abdurrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Was this a trap for Russia? It looks like it was. Almost forced into a trap.
Yeah, no, I think there's elements of that. But having said that, it's kind of like an unavoidable trap.
Yeah.
Because as I said, I don't think Putin is in a position. I don't think Putin is in a position to just ignore Ukraine becoming, part of NATO. In the same way that in 2014, when a regime which was supportive of the Russians and which was like a client state was deposed, was overturned, and he acted immediately in terms of going into Crimea. So this is the sorts of action which he had no choice on. So yes, I can see there's elements of a trap there for various reasons which I mentioned earlier, but it's kind of an unavoidable matter, meaning that it's not something he really has a choice on, because it's the vital interest in the defense of your nation is of the highest priority.
Is that, Sheikh, before I take the next question, is that something, a trap that is created, or, that this was, is this, do you think the U.S. was constantly thinking about this to kind of push NATO in, where it becomes a thorn in the back of Russia? This is a well thought out, or this is not a surprise. I don't think this was a surprise. This was a well thought out plan to kind of put Russia in a situation where, okay.
Yeah, there was a verbal agreement with Gorbachev that there would be no expansion of NATO eastwards by even 1 inch, right? And we've seen many countries been brought into, so it was a complete lie. It's not unusual. The Americans are actually quite, good at breaking their promises. They had the Kyoto Climate Agreement, which they dropped in the time of Trump. You've got the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they've ignored in many elements in terms of development of new weapons. You've got the agreement with Iran, which they just dropped, in the time of Trump. They just dropped the agreement. So whether there was a written agreement or not, it doesn't matter. You know, they agreed with Gorbachev that they wouldn't be expanding eastwards, and they have. So you have to say, well, that's part of a plan. So what is that plan? You know.
In the last question, and then I think maybe with Brother Ahmad asking a question, you know, on the issue of industrial building. I mean, should we build our infrastructure? You know, if you are Iran now, I mean, and you're watching this thing happen, would Iran? I don't know if I'm sure they're sensible enough. Would your advice to them would be that become nuclear power as soon as possible? I mean, as part of the infrastructure development, would that be one advice to a Muslim country?
The situation in Pakistan, whereby they developed nuclear weapons, it was a strategic move, and of importance in the sense that, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to make ready all you can of forces, of weapons. You know, so this is it. Now, it doesn't mean one is going to use it. So that the use of such weapons is another matter. But the existence of having such weapons, you know, particularly when your enemies like India next door has such weapons, you know, is important to have, you know, or the Zionist state for that matter, for example. So the world has managed to keep this doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, M-A-D, and that has kept us away from nuclear conflicts, you know, over the last, you know, 70 odd years. So we also need to see this as important for us.
Next question. So I guess the answer is yes. Okay. All right. 5 minutes. Atif Hussein, my question is for Ustaz Jamal. Is Pakistan moving towards working for China and Russia rather than the West?
Well, I wouldn't use this word working for, because obviously we should not be working for, and unfortunately at the moment we're working for the IMF, because I believe half of the tax revenues are going towards paying interest. 60% of GDP going towards paying interest on these outrageous loans which we've been entrapped with in Pakistan. So that is the problem. But in terms of relationships and strategic positions, then one has to be careful with all of these nations, these large powers, because it's not a free transaction. It's not something which you're entering into without certain conditions, or control. It's like when you take out a loan with the IMF, they do what they call conditionalities. They want you to liberalize your economy. They want you to privatize certain of your key assets. They want you to devalue your currency. I mean, all of these things run counter to what Islam says. So you have to be very careful about all of these relationships or potential relationships. Having said that, it's useful that there is dialogue with some of these other powers, and it's just a great shame, for example, that Imran Khan failed to put any pressure whatsoever on China over the situation with the Ujirs in East Turkestan. And it's also a great shame that Imran Khan, when he was in Russia recently, in fact, last 2 weeks, when he was there just before the conflict broke out, that he was not actually, carrying the interests of Islam and Muslims, rather than very narrowly defined dialogue, with a tyrant who has been basically oppressing Muslims, as we saw in Chechnya. or we see in Crimea, occupation of Muslim lands
Syria,
and the oppression of Muslims in Russia, which is horrendous. We're not seeing advocates against that. What we're seeing is just a palsy, go and shake hands and discuss some other matters, but the key interests of the Muslim Ummah are rarely on the agenda.
Question number another question. So, Sheikh, just because of time, we are really pushing it, I know, but the last question, I promise, that how much does politics, and the world affairs have to do with the relationship with the currencies that one has? I mean, if does. I mean, what is more important, currency, or is it military, or is it both?
It is both. The key thing is to be the dominant currency in the world, and that is very firmly the US dollar, as we said in the early part of the program. So that provides this, they call it an exorbitant privilege, meaning that there's big demand for dollars, for example, in the petrodollar, to settle, oil transactions. So that means that the American government can get away with overspending because there's always a demand for the dollar. Whereas if you're, Venezuela and, you overspend, then people don't want to use the Venezuelan bolivar, they don't want to know about it. Or the same of Argentina, or the same with the Turkish lira, because these are currencies which, they get easily inflated. The governments are out of control in their spending and they don't have any stability. Now, you can argue that the Americans are getting out of control on their spending, but because there's very high demand for the dollar, it keeps the value high relative to others. So actually one commentator, he said that it's the least dirty shirt in the laundry, meaning that all those currencies are dirty because they're being deflated, but the dollar is the least dirty shirt because it's got high demand. So that's one side of it, but obviously the military side, one reason why the dollar is dominant is because the US has got more than 100 military bases all over the world. So they can project their power. And, if somebody, like a Gaddafi starts making noises about going to gold, and using gold standard and what have you, then it's not difficult for him to be taken out. And he was taken out, as an example. So both of them are important. You can't ignore, the military in terms of your position, and you can't ignore currency, in particular, gold.
Then how would Islamic State avoid that? I mean, if you're Libya, and you're saying that, look, the moment these guys declare gold, is that because the ideological, they were just not, Libyans were just not there. Gaddafi obviously had no ideology other than, I don't know what he had, but, but from looking at from the perspective that he did want to bring gold and then he's taken out, how do we look at the coming of a state that wants to bring about, this type of change?
Well, the key thing is that the next Khilafah Rashida state is going to be established in an area which is strong. I mean, Libya on its own was not any ambitions to be an Islamic state, as you rightly say. Gaddafi was following his green book, which was a load of nonsense, really. But he had some narrow interest in things like a gold standard, or an African standard, which he wanted to maybe strengthen his leadership in Africa. So he's got some regional ambitions. So it's not so difficult to take him out because Libya is quite a small, state. It's not particularly strong and it's not well defended. But a Turkey, Egypt, the Pakistan, these are major powers. So it's not so easy to attack these places. So if the Khilafah comes in any of these areas, they've got large militaries, they've got large resources, they've got an ability to have self-sufficiency to an extent. So this is important for the next Khilafah state. But if you're going to say, well, we're going to establish it in Morocco, I'll say, well, they'll overrun it in a couple of weeks, So it's not, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was seeking nusra, when he was seeking the support to establish the first Islamic state, he went to various tribes and he asked them their military capabilities. The Bani Amr, the Bani Kinda, the Bani Shayban, Taif, all of these places. And some said, we'll support you, but we can't defend you against the Romans or the Persians, So this means that you can't establish a Khilafah state in an area where you can't defend yourself. So this is why, you look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan. This is a powerful region. Turkey is powerful. Egypt, others. And again, we don't have to look at these Sykes-Picot drawn lines on the map either. Lebanon is not strong enough to be a state, but Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq. If you're looking this way in terms of the totality of a region, you can see much greater strength. So this is the way we need to be thinking, and not saying, we want to have a Khilafah in Lebanon. I mean, it's not going to happen in Lebanon on its own. It's not going to happen in Jordan on its own. But if you have a mentality of actually looking at a region as a regional power, what's divided? These people are Muslims. We're the same. We're not different people.
So you're saying that it's very important that we look at the asbab or the realities when we are looking at when we're making the strategy, and I think the Muslims, we need to be looking. I mean, at least have that understanding of reestablishing a place where it can survive an onslaught and can continue on, even if it is put in this situation. With that, Sheikh, we will have to end it here. But this will not be. This is not the last conversation. This is a continuation of, inshallah, because there's a lot of points that are put down that we really need to discuss. I mean, even finance itself, we need to discuss as far as, because you mentioned a lot of contracts, the types of contracts that, inshallah, we have to bring you back to discuss, inshallah, and strategic nature of the world and where it's moving. I mean, this was, I think, a very eye-opening intellectual conversation. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wallah, Jazakallah khair for your time, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to use you for the benefit of this ummah. Ameen. Allahumma ameen. Brothers and sisters, with that, we will end this program. We will be back again next Jum'ah, and the next Jum'ah we have Dr. Abu Talha. He's coming back, and this Ukraine thing is not going anywhere for a while, so we're going to have to discuss Ukraine and the strategic nature of this war. And as Muslims, I think it's very important that we should be looking at it from this perspective of how can we utilize this as an opportunity for the Muslims themselves, and where do we stand in this situation? Where are our intellectuals? Where are our ulama? Where are our thinkers? Where are our people who should be looking at this world from the perspective of Islam, from the viewpoint of Islam, the ideological nature of Islam, and should be teaching us, should be guiding us, should be giving us new ways of thinking about what's happening in the world. We are part of this world, brothers and sisters. We live in this world. We are we are 1.2 billion population of the world, if not actually 2 billion. I'm sorry, whatever the Muslims are, and at this point we have no role in the world. As we were discussing with with brother Jamal, I mean, we've been slapped around for the last 96 years. So it's time that the Muslims start thinking, how do we build ourselves, how do we reestablish our state, how do we play the role that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us to play, which is هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركين ولو كره الكافرون. Another place. So a lot of things that need to be discussed, inshallah. There is also I've been asked to please, brothers, tomorrow, many of you who are watching, please, we need volunteers for tomorrow, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. We have a container that is leaving to Syria, another hotspot, a desperate area of the Muslim world that is dying to survive. So please, tomorrow, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., we will need a lot of help. Please, especially the youth, it's a call out, be here. Give us your energy, your time, learn, understand, think, use your energy to benefit the Ummah, inshallah. This is the way we should be thinking. So inshallah, some of you, I will see you guys tomorrow, and see you next time on Friday. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
شبابا قد أنابا وإلى الله استجابا إن من يرجو الثواب لا يبالي بالصعاب في سبيل الله نمضي نبتغي رفع اللواء فليعد للدين مجد وليعد للدين عز منا الدماء يا شبابا قد أنابا وإلى الله استجابا إن من يرجو الثواب لا يبالي بالصعاب